The brick wall of the Corvathian Imperial War College exploded inward in a shower of masonry and academic pride. Through the smoking hole came a single-seat training fighter, upside down, backwards, and somehow still accelerating despite having theoretically run out of fuel 6 minutes ago. The fighter clipped a ceremonial statue of the Academy's founder, scraped along the polished floor, and finally came to rest nose first in the wall opposite, engines still whining at frequencies that suggested imminent mechanical breakdown. Instructor Ketval, whose 4 centuries of military experience had prepared him for many things, stared at the destruction with the slow horror of someone watching his pension evaporate in real time. Around him, the Academy's most promising cadets, future admirals and generals of the Corvathian Empire, sat frozen in their seats, still holding their styluses over tactical assessment forms they'd been working on before physics decided to take a holiday. The fighter's canopy popped open with a cheerful hiss. Out climbed a human, shaking debris from her hair like she'd just finished a particularly vigorous shower, rather than demolishing several thousand years of architectural tradition. "Navigation exercise complete," she announced to the room at large, consulting a tablet that was somehow still functioning despite having been through what could generously be called an unplanned kinetic educational experience. Though I think there might be a small calibration error in the Academy's coordinate system. Ketval found his voice, though it came out roughly 2 octaves higher than usual. "Cadet, what did you just do?" The human looked around the classroom, as if noticing her audience for the first time. "Oh, hi everyone. Sorry about the wall, and the statue, and—" she gestured vaguely at the smoking crater that used to be the East Wing's structural integrity. "Generally speaking, all of this—" "The navigation course," Ketval said slowly, his 3 hearts working overtime to process what he was seeing, "was supposed to take you around the Academy. Around, not through." "Right, about that." The human pulled up a holographic display from her tablet, showing a flight path that looked like it had been plotted by someone having an active seizure. "Your navigation computers use base 8 coordinate systems, but your distance measurements are in base 12. I kept converting wrong and ending up inside solid objects." She paused, frowning at the display. "Well, mostly solid objects. That gas giant was more of a suggestion than an actual barrier." Instructor Morth, who taught advanced tactical theory and had witnessed 3 major wars without losing his composure, raised a trembling hand. "Did you just say you flew through a gas giant?" "Just the upper atmosphere. Anything deeper would have been showing off." The human tapped her tablet again. "Though I did get some interesting readings on atmospheric density variations that might be useful for stealth approaches. Want to see?" The classroom erupted into chaos. 23 of the galaxy's most elite military cadets began shouting questions, objections, and what sounded like prayers in various languages. Instructor Ketval was trying to simultaneously call security, medical services, and possibly an exorcist. Morthic had begun hyperventilating in a way that suggested his species wasn't meant to process this much confused terror at once. Through it all, the human stood calmly beside her crashed fighter, occasionally making notes on her tablet, as if documenting a mildly interesting scientific observation. "Quiet!" Ketval's voice cut through the pandemonium like a plasma torch through tissue paper. The room fell silent, except for the gentle crackling of small fires and the distant sound of emergency vehicles approaching. "Cadet, explain, now!" The human looked genuinely puzzled by the reaction she'd caused. "Explain what? The navigation error? I already told you about the coordinate system problem. Simple fix, really. Just need to standardize your mathematical bases, or add conversion protocols to the flight computers. You crashed through the Academy's east wall. Well, yes. That's what happens when you aim for empty space and end up inside a building." She gestured at the hole behind her. "Basic cause and effect. Though I have to say, your construction techniques are impressive. Most walls would have completely destroyed the fighter, instead of just redirecting it into a controlled crash." Ketval felt something that might have been an aneurysm starting behind his left eye. In 400 years of teaching military strategy to the Empire's finest minds, he had never encountered a cadet who could discuss violating fundamental laws of physics with the casual air of someone commenting on the weather. "How," he said carefully, "are you still alive?" The human brightened considerably, as if he'd finally asked the right question. "Oh, that's the interesting part. Your training fighters are designed for Corvathian physiology, right? Higher bone density, better impact resistance, that sort of thing. But human skeletal structure is more flexible, so we can actually absorb higher G-forces without structural damage." She pulled up another display showing comparative anatomy charts. "Plus, your safety systems assume the pilot will panic under stress and make predictable bad decisions. Since I was expecting to crash from about the 3rd minute of the flight, I could plan for it. Much safer when you're not surprised." The room had gone quiet again. But this time, it was the silence of minds struggling to process information that didn't fit into any existing category. Cadet Zektar, whose family had served the Empire with distinction for 12 generations, slowly raised his hand. "You expected to crash." "Sure. Did you see that flight plan? I've been practicing navigation exercises for 6 weeks now, and I crash roughly 80% of the time, usually into asteroids or space debris, though. This is my first building." She said it with a note of pride that suggested crashing into architecture was some kind of personal achievement. Instructor Morthic, who had recovered enough to speak without whimpering, leaned forward in his chair. "If you keep crashing, why are you still here? Why haven't you been expelled?" The human's expression shifted slightly, becoming more thoughtful. "Good question. I've been wondering about that myself. I mean, I fail pretty much every test, crash most of the vehicles I'm assigned, and my tactical assessments usually get marked as creative but impractical." She paused. "Though I notice my classmates' scores have been improving since I started studying with them." That was when Ketval realized they might have a bigger problem than simple property damage. 3 days later, the Academy Council convened an emergency session. The east wall had been repaired. The fighter had been removed, in pieces, and the human cadet had been temporarily housed in a reinforced dormitory while they decided what to do with her. Grand Admiral Vorfex, whose presence at an Academy disciplinary hearing was roughly equivalent to summoning a natural disaster to resolve a parking dispute, reviewed the incident reports with the expression of someone discovering that reality had filed for divorce and was taking half of everything. "Let me understand this correctly," he said to the assembled faculty. "This human has crashed 64 training vehicles, failed every written examination, destroyed or damaged 12 different facilities, and somehow convinced the medical staff that consuming beverages hot enough to melt steel is normal for her species." "That's correct, Admiral," Ketval confirmed miserably. "And you want to keep her?" "We believe she presents a unique learning opportunity," Dean Clorthick said carefully. "Her unconventional approaches to standard problems have generated extensive discussion among the student body." Unconventional. The Admiral's tone suggested he was considering whether having the entire faculty court-martialed might be simpler than continuing this conversation. "She flew through a gas giant. The upper atmosphere only concern a navigation exercise into an architecture lesson. The repairs were completed ahead of schedule," she asked the quartermaster. "If human ships come with impact-rated snack storage, because apparently crashing makes her hungry." Dean Clorthrek shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Her dietary requirements have been unusual, yes." Grand Admiral Vorth set down the reports and fixed the faculty with a stare that had intimidated enemy fleets into surrender. "Gentlemen, in my centuries of service, I have seen war crimes, political disasters, and bureaucratic catastrophes that defied description. But this is the first time I've encountered a cadet who treats military training like an extreme sport. However," he continued, and something in his tone made the entire faculty sit up straighter, "her test scores are fascinating." Dean Clark blinked. "Sir, she fails every exam, but her failure analyses are more comprehensive than most graduates' thesis projects. She crashes every vehicle, but her post-crash reports have identified 36 previously unknown design flaws. She destroys equipment, but somehow the equipment works better after she's finished with it." The Admiral pulled up a holographic display showing Academy statistics. "More importantly, the cadets studying with her have shown improvement in creative problem-solving, adaptive thinking, and crisis management that we haven't seen in 50 years. He looked around the room with an expression that might have been amusement if admirals were capable of such things. So, here's what we're going to do. We're keeping her. Keeping her? Ketval sounded like he was contemplating retirement as a special project. Official designation, Applied Chaos Theory in Military Education. She stays, she continues her educational experiments, and we study the results. But, Admiral, the insurance costs alone will be worth it if she can teach our officers to think like she does. The Admiral stood, signaling the end of the discussion. Besides, how much more damage can one human possibly do? The faculty exchanged glances that suggested they really didn't want to find out, but they were about to learn anyway. The morning after the Admiral's decision, Instructor Ketval found himself standing outside Dormitory Block C, holding a tablet full of revised Academy protocols, and wondering if his military career had somehow taken a wrong turn into experimental psychology. The dormitory was the Academy's newest building, constructed with reinforced walls, impact-resistant windows, and what the engineering corps had euphemistically called enhanced structural flexibility. It had been built specifically to house one human cadet, which said things about the Academy's recent experiences that Ketval preferred not to think about too deeply. He knocked on the door marked Cadet Holloway and immediately heard a series of sounds that suggested someone was either conducting advanced chemistry experiments or preparing breakfast in a way that violated several interstellar safety protocols. "Come in," came a cheerful voice from inside. "Mind the steam." Ketval opened the door and was immediately engulfed in a cloud of vapor that smelled like burning metal and something his translator couldn't identify, but his survival instincts definitely wanted him to avoid. Through the haze, he could see Holloway standing over what appeared to be a modified food synthesizer that was glowing cherry red and making sounds no kitchen appliance should make. "Just finishing breakfast," Holloway said, apparently unaware that her morning routine was producing environmental conditions that most species would consider hostile to life. "Want some coffee? I finally figured out how to get the synthesizer to produce temperatures above the boiling point of lead." "That's concerning," Cattell managed, trying to breathe through his mouth. "Cadet Holloway, we need to discuss your new status at the Academy." "Oh, right, the Applied Chaos Theory thing." Holloway turned off whatever infernal process she'd been running, and the air began to clear enough for Ketval to see that her quarters looked like a combination between a research laboratory and a disaster zone. "I have to admit, I was wondering when someone would make it official." "You knew?" "Well, sure. You don't keep a cadet who crashes 64 vehicles unless you're studying something." She poured herself a cup of coffee that was steaming in patterns that suggested it was still undergoing nuclear fusion. "Though, I appreciate finally getting a dormitory built to proper human structural standards. The old one kept falling down whenever I sneezed." Ketval consulted his tablet, trying to focus on Academy business instead of the fact that Holloway was casually drinking what appeared to be molten copper. "Your new designation comes with certain responsibilities. You'll be continuing your regular coursework, but you'll also be participating in special training exercises designed to test unconventional approaches to military problems." "Unconventional approaches?" Holloway grinned, and something about that expression made Ketval's survival instincts start sending urgent messages. "I like it. What kind of exercises?" "Well, for starters, the Admiral wants you to review our current tactical simulation programs. Apparently, your failure analyses have identified patterns that our strategic planning computers missed." Holloway set down her coffee cup, which immediately began etching patterns into the metal table surface. "You mean the simulations where I keep accidentally winning by doing everything wrong?" "You what? Oh, come on. You didn't notice?" Holloway pulled up a holographic display from a tablet that looked like it had been through several small explosions. "Look at Simulation Exercise 42. I was supposed to demonstrate proper fleet coordination by following established formation protocols, right? But I kept miscalculating the positioning coordinates and ended up with ships scattered all over the battlefield." The display showed a tactical overview that made Ketval's eyes water just looking at it. Ships positioned in patterns that defied every principle of military organization, movement vectors that seemed random, coordination protocols that looked like they'd been designed by someone who'd never heard of the concept of military strategy. "It looks like chaos," he said weakly. "Exactly. But look what happened when the simulation ran the enemy AI against it. Holloway manipulated the display, showing the exercise playing out in fast forward. The enemy tactical computer spent so much processing power trying to predict our formation patterns that it couldn't adapt when we started accidentally surrounding it. Kethval watched in growing horror as the chaotic human formation systematically dismantled the enemy forces through what appeared to be pure unpredictability. That's not... You can't... Military strategy doesn't work that way. Says who? Holloway took another sip of her architectural-grade coffee. Your tactical computers are designed to counter logical, predictable strategies. But what happens when the strategy isn't logical? When there's no pattern to predict? She pulled up another simulation, then another. In each one, Holloway's spectacular failures to follow proper military doctrine had resulted in accidental victories that the Academy's strategic analysis computers couldn't explain. The beautiful thing, Holloway continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that she was casually destroying several thousand years of military theory, is that it's not random. There's actually a pattern to effective chaos. You just have to think about it differently. Kethval realized that his tablet was shaking and that the shaking was coming from his own hands. Cadet Holloway, are you telling me that you've been deliberately failing in order to test theoretical applications of strategic unpredictability? Well, when you put it like that, it sounds much more sophisticated than what I was actually doing. Holloway grinned again. Mostly, I was just trying to figure out why your training programs assumed everyone would make the same mistakes. Seemed more educational to make different mistakes and see what happened. She gestured around her quarters, which Kethval now realized were filled with detailed notes, analysis charts, and what appeared to be a comprehensive study of Academy training protocols from the perspective of someone who had systematically broken all of them. Besides, Holloway added, my study group partners have been getting much better scores since they started learning to think around problems instead of through them. Hasn't anyone mentioned that? Kethval thought about the recent improvement in tactical scores, the increased creativity in cadet assessments, the way students had been asking questions that their instructors couldn't answer. He thought about Holloway's failures and her detailed analysis of why everything had gone wrong. He thought about the fact that the Academy's most promising cadets had been studying with someone who approached military education like an experimental science. Cadet Holloway, he said slowly, exactly what do you think you're teaching them? Holloway considered the question while her coffee cup continued its slow-motion assault on the table surface. How to win wars that haven't been fought yet, I think. Your academy teaches students to be very good at solving the problems you know how to solve. But what happens when the enemy doesn't follow your textbooks? She looked at him with an expression that was suddenly much more serious than her usual casual destruction of academic property. What happens when the next war looks nothing like the last one? 6 months after Holloway's official designation as the Academy's resident chaos theorist, the annual Corvathian War Games began with all the pomp and ceremony that 4 centuries of military tradition could provide. The Academy's senior cadets had been preparing for this moment their entire academic careers, a chance to demonstrate their tactical brilliance in a massive simulation that would determine their post-graduation assignments. Holloway stood in the command center wearing the same expression she'd worn during her first navigation crash, mild interest mixed with the kind of casual preparedness that suggested she'd already accepted that something would inevitably go wrong. Remember, cadets, Instructor Kethval announced to the assembled students, this simulation will test everything you've learned about coordination, strategy, and leadership under pressure. You'll be facing our most advanced tactical AI, representing a hostile force with superior numbers and fire. Cadet Zektar, whose family's military honors could fill a small library, nodded seriously. Around him, the Academy's finest minds focused on their tactical displays with the intensity of religious devotion. These were beings bred for warfare, educated in the finest strategic traditions, trained to command fleets and armies across the galaxy. Holloway was reading what appeared to be a maintenance manual for the simulation's weapon systems. Cadet Holloway, Kethval said with the weary tone of someone who'd learned to expect the unexpected, do you have any questions about the exercise parameters? Just one, Holloway said, looking up from her manual. The simulation weapons are supposed to be harmless training variants, right? Reduced power, safety limiters, that sort of thing? Of course, standard Academy protocol. Holloway made a note on her tablet. And someone definitely checked that the simulation boundaries are properly isolated from actual ship systems? A cold feeling began forming in Ketval's stomach. Why would you ask that? Well, according to this manual, the simulation network connects directly to the Academy's main defense grid for realistic threat assessment. But there's a footnote here about potential cross-center interference if someone tries to hack the simulation from outside. She showed him a page covered in technical diagrams that made his head hurt just looking at them. Probably nothing, but it does seem like the kind of thing someone might want to double-check before we start shooting at things. Ketval felt the cold feeling expand into something approaching existential dread. Cadet Holloway, are you suggesting that the War Games simulation could be compromised? I'm suggesting that your security protocols assume no one would be crazy enough to attack a military academy during a training exercise. Holloway's tone was conversational, but her eyes had taken on the sharp focus that appeared whenever she was analyzing something that was about to explode. Which is probably a reasonable assumption, unless you're dealing with someone who thinks like, she trailed off, her expression shifting to something Ketval had never seen before, genuine concern, like someone who doesn't follow the rules, she finished quietly. That was when the first explosion ripped through the Academy's eastern defense grid. Emergency lights bathed the command center in hellish red, as klaxons wailed and tactical displays began showing readings that no simulation was supposed to generate. Through the reinforced windows, Ketval could see actual starships dropping out of hyperspace. Sleek, aggressive, vessels that definitely weren't part of any training program. This is impossible, Zektar said, staring at his display with the expression of someone watching fundamental laws of reality file for bankruptcy. The simulation can't generate real ships. That's because they're not simulated, Holloway said matter-of-factly, her fingers dancing across her tablet as she pulled up sensor readings that shouldn't have existed. Someone's using the War Games as cover for an actual attack. Pretty clever, really. Wait until all the Academy's defenses are locked into training mode, then hit them with real weapons while everyone thinks it's just an exercise. A second explosion, closer this time, sent vibrations through the floor that made it clear this was no longer an academic exercise. How did you know? Ketval demanded, trying to process the fact that his most problematic cadet had apparently predicted an attack that his most advanced security systems hadn't detected. I didn't know, I just prepared for the possibility. Holloway was already moving toward the emergency weapons locker, moving with the kind of purposeful efficiency that suggested she'd thought about this exact scenario. Rule 1 of chaos theory. If something can go wrong in an interesting way, it probably will. She paused at the weapons locker, then turned to face the other cadets with an expression that was suddenly, terrifyingly serious. Quick question. Does anyone remember if the Academy stocks actual ammunition, or are all our weapons loaded with training charges? The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of another explosion, and what might have been Ketval whimpering. Right, Holloway said, interpreting the silence correctly. So we're about to be attacked by real weapons while armed with the equivalent of very expensive noisemakers. Anyone have any thoughts on how to handle that? Zektar, whose strategic training had covered every conceivable military scenario except this one, made a sound like a computer attempting to divide by zero. Around him, the Academy's finest minds began displaying the kind of creative paralysis that came from encountering a problem that wasn't in any textbook. Okay, new plan, Holloway announced, breaking into the weapons locker with techniques that definitely weren't covered in standard cadet training. We're going to treat this like a practical examination in adaptive problem solving. The question is, how do you defeat a superior enemy force when all your assumptions about available resources turn out to be wrong? She emerged from the locker carrying what appeared to be a collection of spare parts, maintenance tools, and components that weren't meant to be weapons, but could probably be convinced to become them with sufficient motivation. First lesson, she continued, beginning to assemble something that violated several weapons safety protocols. When the situation is impossible, change the situation. We can't fight them with conventional weapons, so we don't fight conventionally. Another explosion shook the Academy, and through the command center's displays, they could see enemy forces advancing through the outer defenses with the methodical precision of professionals who'd done this before. Cadet Holloway, Ketval said weakly. What exactly are you planning to do? Holloway looked up from her improvised construction project with the same cheerful expression she'd worn while drinking molten coffee. "I'm going to teach everyone the most important lesson in human military doctrine," she said. "How to cheat." The attacking fleet consisted of 12 heavy cruisers and twice that many support vessels, a force that could have challenged a small planetary defense fleet. They'd timed their assault perfectly, waiting until the Academy's weapons were locked into training mode and most of the regular military forces were engaged in exercises elsewhere. What they hadn't planned for was Cadet Holloway treating their carefully orchestrated attack like a particularly interesting homework assignment. "Zektar, I need you to access the Academy's environmental controls," she said, continuing to assemble devices from spare parts with the casual expertise of someone who'd been improvising explosives since childhood. "Can you flood sections 12 through 18 with coolant gas?" "The environmental systems. But those aren't weapons." "No, they're better than weapons. They're infrastructure." Holloway held up what looked like a small electronic device that was humming ominously. "Weapons are designed to destroy things efficiently. Infrastructure is designed to control environments. Guess which one's more useful when your enemy expects you to fight fair?" She turned to another cadet, a nervous Altarian whose primary qualification was an encyclopedic knowledge of military regulations. "Korvek, I need you to override the Academy's communication protocols and start broadcasting our tactical training exercises on all military frequencies, but that would violate operational security." "Exactly. Rule 2 of chaos theory. When the enemy knows what you're supposed to do something else entirely." Holloway's device beeped softly, and she made a final adjustment that caused it to emit a sound like angry electricity. "They're monitoring our communications to track our responses, right? So let's give them something to monitor." The third explosion was close enough to crack the command center's reinforced windows, but instead of panic, Holloway's makeshift team was beginning to display something that looked suspiciously like coordinated purpose. "What about reinforcements?" Zektar asked, trying to access environmental controls while simultaneously monitoring enemy movements. "Shouldn't we call for help?" "Already tried," Ketval said grimly. "Communications are being jammed and the nearest military response team is 40 minutes away. By then," he didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone could see the tactical displays showing enemy forces advancing through the Academy's outer perimeter with the inexorable efficiency of professionals who'd planned this assault down to the minute. 40 minutes, Holloway mused, apparently untroubled by the fact that they were about to be overrun by superior forces. "Plenty of time." "Plenty of time for what?" Ketval demanded. Holloway smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, Ketval understood why Grand Admiral Vortex had looked simultaneously fascinated and terrified when discussing her training methods. "To teach them why human military doctrine doesn't have rules," she said. "Only suggestions." She activated her improvised device, and every light in the Academy went out. In the sudden darkness, her voice carried with the calm authority of someone who'd been expecting this moment all along. "Lesson 3, everyone. When you can't win the fight they want, make them fight the one you choose." What happened next would be discussed in military academies across the galaxy for decades to come, though most of the official reports would classify the details as too unconventional for standard tactical analysis, which was probably for the best, since human creativity under pressure wasn't a subject most military theorists were prepared to include in their curriculum. In the absolute darkness that followed Holloway's power cut, the command center became a laboratory for lessons that no military academy had ever thought to teach. "Emergency lighting should activate in 30 seconds, Zektar said, his voice tight with the kind of stress that came from having one's entire worldview challenged by hostile fire and a human with improvised explosives. "No, it won't," Holloway replied calmly from somewhere in the darkness. "I redirected the emergency power to the environmental systems. We're going to need the extra juice for what comes next. But the protocols are suggestions." There was a sound of metal being assembled with practiced efficiency. "First thing about human military thinking. We don't follow doctrine, we adapt it. Your protocols assume that losing power is a problem to be fixed. I'm treating it as a tactical advantage to be exploited." Kettle tried to process this while simultaneously trying to figure out where everyone was in the pitch-black room. "How is being blind an advantage?" "Because we know this facility and they don't." Holloway's voice moved, suggesting she was working on something while talking. They're using thermal imaging and motion sensors to navigate, but their targeting systems depend on visual confirmation for precision strikes. Cut the power, and suddenly their superior technology becomes a liability. A distant explosion suggested the attacking forces were becoming frustrated with the Academy's sudden transformation from a well-lit target into a dark maze. Korvek, have you started broadcasting those training exercises yet? Yes, but I don't understand how. Perfect. Now they're tracking false signals while trying to navigate in the dark. Meanwhile, we're about to use the Academy's own infrastructure against them in ways that violate approximately 63 different articles of interstellar warfare. There was a soft hum as something electronic came online, followed by a sound like pressurized gas being released in controlled bursts. What are you doing? Ketval demanded, blotting the approach corridors with coolant vapor. It's not lethal, but it reduces visibility to about 2 meters and plays hell with thermal imaging. Also, it's heavier than standard atmosphere, so it flows downward into predictable patterns. Another sound, this one like metal components being locked together with frightening precision. Now I'm setting up motion-activated dispenser units loaded with maintenance nanobots. When the enemy troops move through the vapor, they'll get coated with microscopic repair drones that are programmed to fix any technology they encounter. Fix it how? By returning it to factory default settings, which, for military equipment, usually means safe mode, with all weapons disabled and targeting systems reset to training parameters. Jektar's voice carried a note of awe that suggested he was beginning to understand the scope of what Holloway was orchestrating. You're turning their own equipment against them. I'm teaching their equipment to think like Academy property. Functional, but optimized for education rather than warfare. There was satisfaction in Holloway's tone, the kind that came from solving a complex problem with elegant simplicity. Lesson 4. When you can't beat the enemy's weapons, recruit them. A new sound filled the darkness. The distinctive whine of approaching aircraft conducting close support operations. They're bringing in atmospheric craft, Ketval observed with the kind of resignation that suggested he was beyond surprise at this point. Good. That means they're committed to the assault instead of just bombarding us from orbit. Holloway's voice was moving again, and there were more sounds of rapid assembly. Orbital bombardment would be smart, but impersonal. Close air support means they want to capture the facility intact, which gives us opportunities. What kind of opportunities? The kind that involve teaching them why human pilots don't follow flight plans. The emergency lighting finally activated, revealing that Holloway had somehow transformed the command center into what appeared to be a combination electronics workshop and chemical laboratory. Improvised devices covered every surface, jury-rigged assemblies connected to the Academy's infrastructure through methods that would have given safety inspectors nightmares. How did you do all this in the dark? Zektar asked, staring at the organized chaos surrounding them. Practice. You spend enough time crashing vehicles and fixing them afterward, you learn to work without looking. Holloway was wearing what appeared to be a jury-rigged headset connected to the Academy's sensor network. Plus, I've been mapping the facility's infrastructure since I got here. Amazing what you can learn about a place when you keep accidentally breaking it. The Academy shuddered as the first atmospheric craft began their attack runs, but instead of destruction, what followed was a series of confused explosions and the sound of aircraft making emergency landings. What's happening to their air support? Ketval demanded. I may have made some modifications to the Academy's weather control system, Holloway said with obviously false innocence. Turns out, when you generate localized electromagnetic fields at specific frequencies, aircraft electronics start behaving unpredictably. Nothing dangerous. Just, sudden altitude adjustments and navigation system malfunctions. She gestured to a display showing the attacking aircraft scattered across the Academy grounds in various states of undignified emergency landing. The beautiful thing about electromagnetic warfare is that it's completely non-lethal. Their pilots are fine, their aircraft are intact, but their tactical coordination just got reduced to Stone Age levels. Dean Clortheg's voice crackled through the communication system, transmitted from his secure bunker in the Academy's administrative section. Command Center, what is your status? We're reading massive system irregularities across all sectors. We're implementing adaptive countermeasures, Holloway replied before anyone else could speak. How are you holding up over there? The administrative section is secure, but we're cut off from the main facility. The attacking forces have occupied most of the academic wings and are systematically searching for senior staff. Searching how? Standard sweep patterns or something more sophisticated? They appear to be following standard military clearing procedures. Why? Holloway's expression shifted to something that Ketval was beginning to recognize as her teaching moment face. Because standard military clearing procedures assume the enemy will behave logically. Dean, I need you to do something that's going to sound completely insane. At this point, I'm prepared for anything. I need you to start playing classical Korvathian opera through the facility's public address system, loudly. And I need the administrative staff to begin moving through the corridors in patterns that spell out poetry in your native script. The pause that followed suggested Dean Clorthek was questioning his life choices. Cadet Holloway, perhaps you could explain the tactical reasoning? The tactical reasoning is that human doctrine recognizes something your military education doesn't. Armies are made up of individuals, and individuals have psychology. Right now, the enemy commanders are getting reports from their troops that don't make sense. Equipment malfunctioning in coordinated patterns, aircraft falling out of the sky for no reason, corridors full of harmless but inexplicable vapor. She pulled up a tactical display showing the enemy forces' movement patterns, which had shifted from confident advancement to cautious, confused probing. Now we add sensory overload and behavioral patterns that their tactical computers can't interpret. When your enemy stops trusting their instruments and starts questioning their perceptions, they stop thinking like soldiers and start thinking like confused individuals trying not to die. The Academy's public address system erupted with the kind of operatic performance that was usually reserved for formal state occasions. While through the sensor network they could watch administrative staff moving through empty corridors in formations that resembled ancient Korvathian poetry when viewed from above. "This is brilliant," Zektar said with the dawning realization of someone discovering a new mathematical principle. You're not fighting their military capability. You're fighting their ability to process what's happening to them. Lesson 5, Holloway confirmed. When you can't win through superior force, win through superior confusion. Make the enemy defeat themselves by overthinking problems that don't have solutions. Through the displays, they watched the attacking forces' movements become increasingly erratic as their commanders struggled to interpret reports of equipment that repaired itself into uselessness, atmospheric phenomena that disabled aircraft without damaging them, and now sensory experiences that suggested the Academy's defenders had either achieved transcendent tactical genius or complete psychological breakdown. But there's still one problem, Ketval pointed out, studying the tactical readouts. They still have superior numbers and firepower. Even if they are confused, they can still overwhelm us through attrition. Which brings us to Lesson 6, Holloway said, and her tone had shifted to something darker, more serious. Sometimes the best way to win is to make sure your enemy discovers they were fighting the wrong war entirely. She activated a communication array that shouldn't have been able to function with the Academy's power grid in its current state. "This is Academy Defense Control to all attacking forces," she broadcast on military frequencies. "Congratulations. You've successfully assaulted an educational facility, defended by students and instructors using improvised equipment and academic resources." Her voice carried across the complex with the kind of calm authority that turns statements into historical records. "Unfortunately, you seem to have missed the fact that this attack was scheduled for today." The sudden silence from the attacking forces suggested that her words had achieved their intended effect. "That's right," Holloway continued conversationally. "Today is the day we test our new combat curriculum, the one designed to train officers to handle asymmetric warfare, unconventional tactics, and adaptive strategy under pressure." She paused to let the implications sink in. "You've just provided a live-fire practical examination for the next generation of military leaders. I hope you're proud of your contribution to galactic education." Through the sensor displays, they could see the attacking forces beginning to hesitate. Their commanders, presumably processing the suggestion that they might have just walked into something much more sophisticated than they'd expected. "The question now," Holloway said, her voice carrying to every corner of the Academy, "is whether you'd like to surrender and discuss your tactical observations with our students, or continue providing educational opportunities until the regular military arrives to grade the exercise." What followed was the longest silence in the history of military communications. broken finally by a voice that sounded like its owner was reconsidering several major life decisions. Academy Defense Control, this is Strike Commander Vexus. We may have made an error in our intelligence assessment. Holloway smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd just successfully defended a thesis on applied chaos theory. Yes, you did, but don't worry. Making errors is how we learn. Strike Commander Vexguy's surrender had barely been processed when the real shock arrived. A single ship dropped out of hyperspace above the Academy. Sleek, ancient, and broadcasting identification codes that made every military officer in the sector check their historical databases twice. The vessel bore the insignia of the Eldest Council, the galaxy's most secretive and powerful military intelligence organization, a group so old that some species considered them mythical. Holloway was still in the command center, helping her improvised student army catalog the disabled equipment and confused prisoners, when the communication came through. Academy Defense Control, this is Arch-Strategist Multek of the Eldest Council. Permission to come aboard. The request was delivered with the kind of polite formality that suggested it wasn't really a request. Dean Clorthek, who had emerged from his administrative bunker looking like someone who'd spent several hours questioning the fundamental nature of reality, stared at the communication console as if it had just announced the heat death of the universe. The Eldest Council, he whispered. They haven't been seen in public for over a century. Who are the Eldest Council? Holloway asked, apparently unimpressed by titles that made seasoned military officers develop nervous twitches. The galaxy's first military intelligence organization, Ketval explained, his voice carrying the kind of reverence usually reserved for natural disasters. They were analyzing strategic threats before most of our civilizations achieved spaceflight. If they're here, he didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. When the Eldest Council took interest in something, it usually meant that something was about to change the course of galactic history. 20 minutes later, Arch-Strategist Multek stood in the Academy's main briefing room, studying the damage reports with the air of someone grading a particularly interesting examination. The Arch-Strategist was tall, even by galactic standards, with the kind of ageless appearance that suggested either advanced genetic modification or very good living. Their species was unidentifiable, possibly a result of diplomatic neutrality, possibly because they predated current taxonomic classification. Cadet Holloway, Multek said without preamble. You've been very educational. Thank you, Holloway replied, clearly uncertain whether this was a compliment or an indictment. Perhaps I should clarify. The attack on this academy was not a random assault by opportunistic raiders. Multek activated a holographic display showing detailed intelligence files. It was the final phase of a comprehensive evaluation that has been ongoing for the past 18 months. The room went very quiet. You see, the Eldest Council has been monitoring an unusual statistical anomaly in military education outcomes. Specifically, a group of academy graduates who demonstrated unprecedented levels of adaptive thinking, creative problem-solving, and strategic flexibility, all traits that correlated with having studied alongside one particular human cadet. Multek's attention focused on Holloway with the intensity of someone examining a fascinating specimen. We needed to understand whether this was coincidence, intentional manipulation, or something more significant. So, we arranged a field test. You orchestrated an attack on an academy full of students. Dean Clorthek's voice climbed toward frequencies that suggested moral outrage. We orchestrated a learning opportunity, Multek corrected calmly. The attacking forces were volunteers from our strategic testing division, using non-lethal weapons and operating under strict engagement protocols. At no point were students or faculty in actual danger of permanent harm. They paused, consulting their datapad. Though I must admit, Cadet Holloway's countermeasures exceeded our most optimistic projections. Our attacking forces are currently requesting psychological counseling and asking for reassignment to less reality-challenging duties. Holloway was studying the Arch-Strategist with the expression she usually wore when analyzing broken equipment. So this was all a test. The attack was a test. Your response to the attack was illuminating. Multek called up more displays showing tactical analyses, psychological profiles, and educational outcome measurements. In 18 months, You have accidentally revolutionized military thinking in ways that our most advanced strategic computers didn't predict. Accidentally, your systematic approach to failing better has produced graduates who think outside established parameters, adapt to unexpected situations, and solve problems through creativity rather than doctrine. These are not skills that traditional military education has successfully cultivated in over 3,000 years. The ARC strategists moved to the window overlooking the academy grounds, where maintenance crews were already beginning repairs that would somehow account for the fact that several buildings had been modified in ways that violated fundamental architectural principles. The question before us, Moltke continued, is whether this represents a beneficial evolution in military education or a dangerous corruption of established systems. Dangerous how? Jektara asked, speaking for the first time since the eldest council's arrival. Because adaptive thinking leads to questioning established authority. Creative problem-solving encourages individuals to ignore orders when circumstances change. Strategic flexibility suggests that doctrine should be viewed as guidance rather than law. Moltke turned back to face the room. These are not traits that traditional military hierarchies find comfortable. Holloway nodded slowly, as if pieces of a complex puzzle were finally falling into place. You're saying that teaching people to think for themselves might make them harder to control. Precisely. Which brings us to the purpose of my visit. Moltke activated a new display, showing what appeared to be formal legal documents. The Galactic Military Education Council has reviewed your unconventional contributions to academy training. They have concluded that your methods represent either revolutionary advancement or systematic subversion of military order, and their decision? They are offering you a choice. The documents resolved into official text with multiple signatures and seals that represented authority on a galactic scale. Accept immediate exile from all military institutions and territories, with the understanding that your teaching methods will be classified as dangerous to military morale and discipline. The room held its breath. Or accept appointment as the galaxy's first director of adaptive military education, with authority to redesign combat training protocols for all major military academies. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Dean Clairtech making a noise like a computer attempting to process paradoxical information. Let me understand this correctly, Holloway said slowly. Either I leave and pretend none of this happened, or I get to officially teach the entire galaxy to think like humans? In essence, yes. Holloway looked around the room at the alien officers and cadets who had spent the last few hours learning that their fundamental assumptions about warfare, education, and problem-solving might need revision. Can I see the curriculum approval process for the director position? Moltke raised what might have been an eyebrow. You want to review the bureaucratic procedures. I want to understand the scope of authority. If I'm going to teach people to break rules effectively, I need to know which rules I'm allowed to break in the process. The art strategist consulted their datapad, then made a sound that could have been laughter. The appointment comes with emergency educational authority and crisis adaptation protocols. Essentially, you would have carte blanche to redesign military training as you see fit, with the understanding that results matter more than methods. And oversight? The eldest council will monitor outcomes and provide guidance as needed. Holloway considered this for a moment, then looked at her improvised student army, alien cadets, who had spent the afternoon learning to weaponize infrastructure and turn their enemy's technology against them. I accept, she said. On one condition, which is, I want these cadets as my first official instructor training class. If we're going to teach the galaxy to think adaptively, we need teachers who understand the principles from experience. Moltke made another note on their datapad. Agreed, though I should warn you that redesigning galactic military education will be significantly more challenging than defending a single academy. Holloway grinned with the expression that had become familiar to everyone who'd experienced her teaching methods. Challenges are just learning opportunities with better documentation requirements. 5 years later, the Corvathian Imperial War College had been renamed the Galaxy Institute for Adaptive Military Studies, and its entrance requirements had been completely rewritten. Instead of looking for cadets with perfect test scores and flawless adherence to military protocol, recruitment officers were specifically seeking candidates who demonstrated creativity under pressure, comfort with ambiguity, and what the official documentation diplomatically termed constructive disregard for conventional limitations. The Institute's new motto, "Failure is education in real time," was carved into the same wall that Holloway had once crashed through during her first navigation exercise. The inscription was placed directly above a plaque commemorating the Holloway Doctrine, which had become required reading at military academies across 17 different star systems. Director Holloway stood in her office, reviewing applications from potential cadets whose files read like creative writing exercises and systematic rule-breaking. Her desk was covered with reports from academy graduates who were revolutionizing military thinking on a dozen different worlds, implementing strategies that combined human adaptability with alien technological sophistication in ways that no strategic computer had predicted. Through her window, she could see the current class of instructor candidates conducting what the official schedule listed as Advanced Infrastructure Improvisation, a course that taught students to turn any environment into a tactical advantage using whatever materials happened to be available. Today's exercise involved defending the academy's cafeteria using only kitchen equipment and condiments. The sound of controlled explosions and creative profanity suggested the lesson was proceeding according to plan. Jektar, now assistant director for creative problem solving, knocked on her doorframe. "Director, we've got 3 more academy systems requesting curriculum consultations, and the Eldest Council wants a progress report on the Tactical Chaos Theory program. Tell them the program is performing exactly as predicted," Holloway replied, watching a group of cadets successfully weaponize a soup dispenser. "Which is to say, it's producing results that no one expected but everyone can appreciate. And the academy system requests? Schedule them for next month. But make sure they understand that adopting our methods means accepting that their graduation ceremonies might occasionally require structural repairs." Jektar made a note on his tablet, then paused. "Director, do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd chosen exile instead?" Holloway considered the question while watching her students turn lunch service into a masterclass in defensive engineering. "Probably the same thing that would have happened if I'd passed my first navigation exam," she said finally. "The galaxy would have learned to solve the same problems in the same ways, and no one would have discovered that there might be better approaches." She turned back to her desk, where applications from potential cadets continued to pile up. Applications from beings who had been told their entire lives that they thought too differently, questioned too much, or approached problems from angles that made their instructors uncomfortable. "Besides," she added, "someone had to teach the galaxy that the best way to prepare for an unknown future is to get really, really good at making things up as you go along." The sound of another creative explosion from the cafeteria suggested that lesson was being learned very well indeed. Across the galaxy, in academies and training facilities that had quietly adopted human methodology as part of their standard curriculum, a new generation of military officers was learning to treat doctrine as a starting point rather than a destination, to view problems as opportunities for innovation, and to remember that the enemy's greatest weakness was often their assumption that everyone would fight fair. The galaxy would never be the same, and somewhere in the administrative files of the Eldest Council, marked as a success beyond all reasonable expectations, was a simple notation: Human Educational Consultant, recommend for permanent retention and expanded authority. The age of adaptive warfare had begun, taught by a species that had always known the most important military principle of all: when you can't win by the rules, change the game.